Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mahalet Getachew, and I'm the Managing Director of Corporate Racial Equity at PolicyLink. Before we begin, I'd like to note a few housekeeping items. The chat is disabled today, but our speakers are all excited to answer your questions, so please submit your questions throughout the program in the Q&A function, and we'll get to as many as we can in the last 15 minutes of our program. Now, for those that would like it, we also have closed captioning available. This event today is brought to you by PolicyLink, FSG, and Just Capital. On behalf of our organizations, we would like to extend our gratitude to Virgin Unite for its support of this event and our work. Now I'd like to turn it over to Michael McAfee, President and CEO of PolicyLink. Michael.
Thank you, Mahalet. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Just want to provide a few remarks to set the stage for what you're going to experience today and kind of ground you in this moment. This is an unprecedented moment, and it's a moment that is needed more than ever. I want you to hold a number as you go through the day. 100 million plus. Think about that. In the richest nation in the world, 100 million people, 1 in 3 folks who are economically insecure. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Can we improve their lives? This is what we work on every day at PolicyLink. You know, PolicyLink is a research and action organization. It's designed to bring about a just and fair society, one in which everyone can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. And we do this by advancing public policies that work for everyone. More specifically, we do this by lifting up what works, lifting up that voice, wisdom, and experience of folks in community, especially community of color, translating their hopes and aspirations into real opportunity. And that's why I want to talk to you about what this moment represents. You know, since the founding of this nation, it's always been an experiment. And somewhere along the way, it seems as if we've forgotten that our democracy is an invitation. It's an experiment. It's an invitation for us to continually work to perfect it, for us to continually work to see each other's humanity, for us to continually work to get in relationship with each other, to design a society that ultimately can be just and fair. Justice and fairness were not fully realized in our founding. And that's okay, because in this moment, we can do that last mile work of bringing about a just and fair society. We don't have to demonize each other. We don't have to call names. We don't have to lament that it wasn't done. We can step into this opportunity that each and every one of us has to step into our own power to bring about the society that we want to see. And that is really what I want to talk to you about, this design challenge. You know, so many of our problems get reduced down to charity, but charity only provides momentary relief. If we really want to earn the right to talk about a return on investment or impact, we've got to hold that absolutely people need charity. They need immediate human relief, but they also need us to do so much more. They need us to design a democracy and an economy that doesn't leave them behind. And we're bold enough and smart enough to do that work. And if you don't take anything away from this session, I hope you take this one thing. It is the design work that you're going to hear my colleagues talking about and calling you to think about how do you want to contribute to that. It is that design work that makes this moment special. We've evolved. We know we can do great programs. We know we can do great initiatives. But the reality ultimately is that the scaling vehicle runs through corporate America and our government. The scaling apparatus is corporate America and government. And corporate America needs to understand that, like it or not, you're on the leading edge of the equity movement. You're on the leading edge of the equity movement because you have a skill set that is unique for this moment. You know how to bend this nation's laws and its regulations to your will. And that is what is needed in service of that 100 million. If we're going to get to the design challenge of the nation, we've got to do that work. So I want to thank you for coming to this moment with intellectual curiosity, with a commitment to see this nation become more just and fair, and for all of the commitments that you've currently made. And more important, for your desire to want to join with us, those of us in government, those of us in civil society, to want to lock arms with us, to be on this march towards freedom. That's what I'm so excited about. Imagine a moment where that 100 million demands so much of us, and yet our sectors are aligned in this noble pursuit of racial equity. Think about that for a moment. Celebrate the fact that the universe has beautifully aligned to have us ready and equipped to step into this moment and to deliver for that 100 million. If we do this, if we can transcend the limitations of charity and think about equity by design for our democracy and our economy, this moment of racial awakening in this country, this opportunity where racial equity is front and center, will not be in vain. So welcome. Now at this time, I would love to introduce you quickly to an amazing CEO who's going to be our featured speaker as we go into the next phase of this agenda. Well, I'm delighted to introduce you to Rose Marcario, former CEO of Patagonia and current board member of Media and Rivian. She's been elevating Patagonia to new heights of impact, advocacy, and success, and she has pushed the standards that business leaders should aim to achieve, especially in this moment. So Rose, I want to thank you to come on screen and share your insights with us.
Thank you, Michael. What a great introduction for this session. Thanks for including me today. I'm very grateful to be on this journey with all of you. And after spending the last dozen years at Patagonia and now as a board member for companies working toward meaningful transformation of our economy at scale, I can say unequivocally that corporate purpose is at a critical juncture, and we need everyone in the fight. Business and our communities are faced with a triple emergency of racial justice, climate, and health. And they're all interconnected, and in some ways might feel insurmountable, but businesses are good at reacting quickly and decisively. And either we embody and innovate a more just and humane economy, or we'll make ourselves extinct with the harm that we do to people, planet, and our fragile democracy. That transformation includes acknowledgement of how institutionalized racism has shaped our current economy. It includes coming to terms with the damage that we've done to our only home, planet Earth. I know from my years at Patagonia how important it is for business to use their voice and their dollars to fight for people and the planet. Whether it was on-site childcare or supporting working families or suing the Trump administration over public lands reductions, when we took a stand for a just cause, it was always good for business. But acknowledgement is not enough. As business leaders, we know that actions speak. We must take bold actions so compelling they can't be undone or cut from a budget cycle. They must create lasting change in our organizations and society. We also have to be transparent about our progress and accountable to how we're measuring up to goals. But we don't have to do it alone. We can do it together, as Michael said, as a business community that will benefit from working together and sharing insights and other progress. One of the things that I love about capitalism is innovation. And innovation will help drive solving some of these biggest problems. And I guarantee that the prospect of working for a company that's fighting for a more just form of capitalism will make your workforce leap out of bed to get to work every morning. When we hold an aspirational vision of the future, to create a more just and inclusive economy. It's important that we understand the structures that got us here. At Patagonia, it was about acknowledging that we were a white-led company building products to recreate on largely stolen native land. And it's one thing to acknowledge, and it's important. It's really important, but it's even more important that we take action, that we invest, that we divest where necessary, that we educate, we train, we participate, and we listen. I'm heartened by my colleagues at Patagonia. They recently committed $1 million toward Georgia voting rights groups. And there are many examples of businesses stepping up in ways we haven't seen before. We know one thing for sure. Being neutral in the face of injustice or silent is complicity with oppression. Business cannot be neutral to racial injustice, nor can it be neutral to the devastation of our planet, or silent as our democracy is attacked or dismantled. Business has a powerful voice, and we can use it to make a better world. We know that racial equity leads to stronger democracy, better products and services, a more diverse consumer base, a stronger workforce, a more resilient organization. There are plenty of good business reasons to act on racial equity, and there are plenty of good business reasons to save our only home, planet Earth. As David Brower famously said, there's no business to be done on a dead planet. I've always believed that business can be the greatest agent for positive change in the world. It's up to us now to create social and ecological systems which are more just and inclusive. This is the time for business to recognize that we must evolve if we are going to survive and make a better world. Thanks for listening.
Amazing. Thank you, Rose, for sharing your powerful perspective. This is precisely the courageous business leadership we need today to build an equitable nation for all of us. And thank you, Michael, for setting the foundation for what this moment requires of all of us. You both said businesses cannot be neutral. We need bold action for lasting change. And that's our mission. At PolicyLink, FSG, and Just Capital, we came together a year ago to publish the CEO Blueprint for Racial Equity. The blueprint is our invitation to business leaders to become leading agents of equity across their spheres of influence. It shares a roadmap for how business leaders can reimagine their actions within their four walls, within communities in which they're situated, and at the broader societal level. And it is part of our collective mission to ignite the racial equity movement more broadly and deeply in corporate America. In the months following the release of the blueprint, to fuel the evolution of our work, we solicited feedback from C-suite leaders across the nation in partnership with Paul Shoemaker, who is also here with us today. Paul is an author, a former Microsoft executive, and founding president of Social Ventures Partners International. Today, we are so excited to share with you our findings from pressure testing the blueprint with C-suite leaders. And after we share our findings, we're going to have a conversation with Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield about the report and their leadership on racial justice issues. And then we'll have time for Q&A with all of our speakers. So let's get started. I'd like to bring in our partner in this effort. Paul, will you come on video? And I'd like to also introduce my colleague, Shaibia Dalal, Director of Strategic Growth and Operations at PolicyLink. Paul, you first. Tell us about the goals of this pressure testing effort. Who did you talk to and what questions did you ask business leaders?
Thank you, Mahalet. And I'll say on a personal level, this was some of the most important and meaningful work I've ever done in my professional career. Just to set the stage for everyone, here's the goals that we set out to. We wanted to identify challenges and opportunities. Where does the pressure come from? What are potential levers? And we really wanted to sort of get to what was the engagement that would be beyond the words. Next slide. And the folks that we talked to, we know there's a little bit of bias in who would show up for this, but we tried to make sure we talked to C-suite. About 2/3 of them were CEOs, the rest were CXOs. We wanted to be across industries, across geographies, size of organizations. So there was a great distribution of organizations. Next slide. And here's the questions that we asked them to try to get at those goals and those folks that we talked to. I'll just add 3 brief personal comments to what stood out to me in those conversations. The first thing is, I don't want to be Pollyanna, but things did change. The middle of that normal distribution, it moved, and it's not moving back. 2020, and especially May 25th, did change how the world thinks about racial equity in corporate America. The second thing I would say is a word that kept coming up for me a lot was alignment, not just between the C-suite and the board, but up and down supply chains and across peer groups. So be thinking about alignment as a tipping point. The last comment I'll say is, don't forget this is right brain, emotional, behavioral work, not just left brain policy work. Part of the system and the design Michael mentioned we're trying to change is how people think about this work. We heard words like visceral, neurosocial, spiritual mindset shift. So think about the right brain in addition to the policies. Thanks, Mahalet.
Thank you, Paul. Each of those takeaways you highlighted are worthy of their own deep discussions. My deepest or biggest takeaway from this work has been that there's multiple challenges and levers for change that we could spend many, many hours discussing. Today, we're sharing our top 7 takeaways, reflecting what we heard from business leaders and the common barriers we see across companies. So let's start with our first takeaway. The first takeaway is a fear of making mistakes. Amongst the business leaders we spoke with, there's clearly, as Paul said, a deeper awareness and authenticity, and awareness of the private sector's shared complicity in perpetuating inequity, and a greater commitment to listen and learn. In the words of one of our interviewees, George Floyd forced leadership to really start listening and learning to be empathetic. At the same time, there's also still a fear of making mistakes that's holding business leaders back from bolder action, whether it's a fear of saying the wrong thing internally or doing the wrong thing externally. We don't want to mess this up was a common theme. It's also clear that some business leaders would take bolder action if they knew what other leaders were doing and that they were doing the same. This safety in numbers mentality is pervasive. Paul, before we go to the next takeaway, would love to hear what struck you the most about this aspect in your interviews.
I think the thing I remember the most, Mahalet, is how, for many people, how deeply personal this was to CEOs. These are real human beings. These are individual people that had emotional, visceral responses to what happened. Obviously, it ultimately has to affect the bottom line. Converging those things matters. But I heard words and emotions and feelings from CEOs I haven't heard before. The word that I heard the most that was unique was listen. CEOs learn to listen.
Thank you, Paul. Let's go on to the second takeaway now. And it is that we need more data and we need more accountability. It is clear to business leaders that transparency matters now more than ever. The calls for greater transparency around the status and impact of diversity and inclusion initiatives are coming from an increasing number of market voices, especially investors. In the words of one interviewee, institutional capital is beginning to speak, they said. The challenge, however, is that there's a painful lack of rigor around data, and we don't have a common accountability framework. We don't have consistent expectations and roadmaps for how companies should approach their racial equity efforts, how they should measure their progress, and what they should disclose. Right now, there's a lot of noise, but what we need is a shared language and approach for achieving racial equity. And we get this pain point, and that's why we at PolicyLink, along with FSG and Just Capital, we're partnering in the process of developing rigorous corporate standards for racial equity, informed by those closest to the challenges and working together with a strong ecosystem of partners. In June, we'll be sharing a lot more about this groundbreaking effort, including how you can get involved. For now, let's go on to the next takeaway. Shaibia?
Thank you, Mahalet. Our conversations also revealed that business leaders are uncertain about the power of equity despite the evidence out there. As one interviewee told us, there's verbal agreement by my board but racism as a corporate issue seems largely orthogonal to them. We know the moral imperative, and the business and macroeconomic cases for advancing racial equity have all been made effectively for years by everyone from the Federal Reserve to McKinsey. Our report includes details about all this research. It will take a shocking 95 years for Black employees to reach parity in the private sector at our current trajectory. 95 years. Another century of inequity is unacceptable and unsustainable. We have all the data for embracing racial equity in corporate America, and it's time for business leaders to prioritize equity as a source of business innovation and growth. If we keep waiting for more compelling cases to be made for racial equity, we risk even more devastating economic inequality and stifled economic growth, especially as we become a majority people of color nation. Paul, before we move on, I'd love to hear from you on why you think this remains a barrier for business leaders.
I think the most tangible thing I can add to this is what I think folks can do to overcome that barrier. And that is to understand that finding this alignment between your C-suite and your board is critical. It is also a tipping point. It creates momentum. The same thing goes for the alignment in the supply chain. I think maybe folks sometimes think this hill is harder to climb or higher to climb than it is. It's difficult, but it is doable, and it starts with the C-suite and the board being in alignment.
Thank you for sharing. Let's move on to the next slide. So several interviewees shared with us that addressing racial inequities feels like a zero-sum game. This mindset and false narrative are not new. There is an ingrained societal suspicion that intentionally supporting one group hurts another. And this hinders some business leaders from tackling issues of race head-on or implementing strategies that target employees, consumers, suppliers, and markets of color. In reality, when we target policies and programs to support historically excluded groups, the benefits cascade upward and outward for all of us. This is known as the curb cut effect. When we create the circumstances that allow those who have been left behind to contribute fully, everyone wins. And conversely, when we ignore the challenges faced by the most vulnerable among us, those challenges are magnified many times over and hamper economic growth and prosperity. Changing the zero-sum narrative is key to advancing equitable business practices and accelerating progress on racial equity. Shifting this narrative will enable business leaders to tap into underserved markets, promote supply chain innovation, effectively advance progressive public policies, and a lot more, ultimately benefiting companies, the economy, and society. Now I'll turn it over to Mahalet for the next takeaway.
Thank you, Shaibia. Now our fifth takeaway is that there's this ongoing tension between near-term perception and long-term impact. We know, and research demonstrates, that long-term strategies are more likely to create lasting impact, but many business leaders have an overpowering sense of urgency to respond to the public's expectations of change with quick actions. This presents headwinds against long-term thinking and more strategic investments. Indeed, one interviewee noted, when these issues are not in the red-hot spotlight, it gives us time to make deep intrinsic changes. On top of this, business leaders often think of racial equity work quite narrowly, as just about diversifying the workforce and undertaking philanthropic activities. But it's much more than that. It's also about understanding the intended and unintended impact of your products, services, operations, policies, and practices on people of color and low-income communities. It's also about understanding the business risk and opportunity cost of ongoing racial inequities within companies and across our society. The cost of talent voting with their feet, hampered productivity, new markets going unexplored, and stifled economic growth. Until business leaders think more broadly along these lines, they will run into decision paralysis in the face of public pressure, and they will fall into the trap of one-off programs and initiatives that ultimately fail to achieve equitable outcomes or lasting change. And now let's go on to our next takeaway.
We also spoke with several small and mid-sized businesses about racial equity. They told us that they feel overwhelmed, don't know where to start, or don't have the time or resources to take on this work. One executive told us, "It seems like I can never do enough. This hasn't been easy." Another said, "I need the baby steps version." There's no one-size-fits-all equity strategy for businesses, nor should there be, given the myriad ways in which business leaders can spur change within companies, communities, and society. In general, a company's racial equity work should scale to its impact, which often correlates to the company's relative size, capacity, and implementation feasibility. It's a misconception that companies need flashy initiatives or large departments to be equitable. What they do need are business leaders willing and able to prioritize equity and approach their everyday decision-making through an equity lens by asking questions like, who benefits? Who decides? Who pays? Who's missing? Is anyone harmed? And using this lens should ultimately become second nature to all business leaders. Let's move to the final takeaway. From our conversations, it's clear that phrases that were once considered taboo in corporate America, like racial equity, social justice, and institutional racism, are now becoming commonplace. In the words of one interviewee, "The first strategy plan I wrote about 3 years ago had the word equity in it and it got crossed out. Now that word is everywhere." This is good change. It's creating space to talk about more complex and critical topics like white supremacy and anti-racism. But the concept of equity is in danger of becoming just another catchphrase of corporate America. It's crucial for all of us, especially business leaders, to protect against equity washing. Issuing solidarity statements and engaging in occasional feel-good charity work without addressing internal inequities, pushing for structural changes, or developing accountability mechanisms is just business as usual. It's insufficient. And companies can only affect meaningful change by centering equity and taking on the hard work of deeply understanding and addressing the impact of their products, services, operations, policies, and practices on people of color and low-income communities. Next slide. We hope these 7 takeaways will help business leaders deepen the important dialogue on racial equity, understand common barriers, and ultimately accelerate the evolution of anti-racist, equitable corporations. The full Corporate Insights report is now available on our websites, and we'll share the link to that report at the end of this program. As Mahalet mentioned earlier, these learnings informed the 2021 iteration of the CEO Blueprint for Racial Equity. This Blueprint 2.0 will share the immediate actions that all companies can take across HR, product design, marketing, philanthropy, governance, and more to authentically get started on an enterprise-wide basis while also setting up for long-term change. The Blueprint will also profile large and small companies that are making progress in the right direction and provide strategic guidance to take advantage of the tremendous opportunity that comes from prioritizing racial equity as a business strategy. And the new Blueprint will lay the foundation for our groundbreaking multi-year work on corporate standards for racial equity. Please join us at our launch event next month. We'll release Blueprint 2.0 and announce our standards development process. And now I'll let Mahalet introduce our next speakers, who you all know and who continue to serve as wonderful examples of the kind of business leadership that we need today to build an equitable nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaibia. We are so fortunate to be joined today by Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield. Please come on camera. You know them as the founders of Ben & Jerry's Homemade Ice Cream. I'm sure you also know them for the social justice issues they've championed for many years while leading their world-renowned company. Like Patagonia, Ben & Jerry's set the model for making profits co-equal with the purpose of improving society. Their legacy of making business a force for social good continues on today at the company and remains one of the leading models for how companies can advance societal change. Now, outside of Ben & Jerry's, the company, Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield are elevating what it means to advance societal change through business leadership even further through their campaign to end qualified immunity, a cross-sector national coalition pursuing police reform. Today, we're going to hear their take on our takeaways and learn more about their racial justice efforts through the campaign to end qualified immunity. Ben, I'm going to start with you. First, welcome again, and thank you so much for being here. So what's your take on our takeaways? What resonates with you? Is anything missing from your perspective?
Well, thanks a lot, Mahalet. I was inspired by the people who have spoken before me. Particularly this comment from Michael that we business leaders know how to bend this nation's law to our will. I think that we've kind of been doing that, and some unintended consequences of that is that a lot of other people have been suffering because business typically has just had the bottom line in mind. So going through the takeaways, number one was the fear of making mistakes. Businesses are always making mistakes, no matter what we do. When we set up a new production facility, we make mistakes. When we do marketing, we make mistakes. It's just a part of doing business. And I think as we get focused on racial justice, there'll also be some mistakes, but there's no problem with making mistakes. The majority of Ben & Jerry's flavors that we've researched never were successful, really. Most of them get canceled. So, and the other thing that I think Ben & Jerry's has learned in terms of working on social issues is to take our leadership from NGOs that have expertise in those issues. And particularly in terms of racial issues, it's been great for us to have a board that is racially diverse. And we take our leadership and consult with them. Once you've got enough non-white people on your board and upper level management, the number of mistakes goes down. It was interesting when we talked about that we need more data and accountability. I think data and accountability is kind of the strength of business. Business knows how to get data and accountability. In terms of the work that we're doing, Jerry and I, in terms of police reform, what we've been finding is that in terms of police departments, data and accountability is where they suffer. I think in so many areas of government that they need businesses' ability to hold people accountable and to collect data. So, there was also this comment about a zero-sum mindset. That you've only got so much energy and resources to go around. If you help one element, you're not helping someone else. Our experience has been that when we devote more time and effort and resources to improving the quality of life in the community, we end up selling more ice cream, we end up being more profitable. The idea that you can't combine those two things, which are essentially the needs of human beings, is false. And I guess, when there was this idea that small businesses are overwhelmed, so much of the work that needs to be done in terms of racial equity can be done on the local level. Small businesses are significant members of their local communities. And that's where they need to exert their influence. So that's my takeaways on the takeaways.
That's powerful. Thank you so much, Ben. You hit 4 of my first questions. Amazing. So refreshing and powerful to have that perspective after many, many years of the work that you have done. Just hearing that, especially now with what business leaders, so many are struggling with, is incredibly powerful. So thank you for sharing those views. I want to make sure we talk about your work right now. You have been both working so hard over the past year on your campaign to end qualified immunity. Jerry, can you tell us a little bit about it? What is it and how did you start?
Sure. Well, I first want to say how nice it is to be here, and I wish I could see all everybody else who's here, knowing that we're all working together and aligned. So that's a wonderful feeling, because you don't always feel that you're with other people who are working on the same things. So the campaign to end qualified immunity is it's a campaign to essentially end a legal doctrine that exists that acts as a get out of jail free card for bad cops. Legally, you can overcome it either by the Supreme Court making a different decision, or you can do it with legislative action, both at the federal level and at different state levels. And so what our campaign is a coalition of about 16 national groups that are very broad constituency, ranging from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the Leadership Council on Civil Rights and the ACLU, to also libertarian and conservative groups, the Cato Institute for Justice, Americans for Prosperity. In addition, we've enlisted about 700 business leaders. There's thousands of professional athletes, musicians, celebrities, and our message is essentially that there needs to be accountability for police the same way there is for any other people. And coming from a business background, Ben and I know that as well as all the other people on this call.
Thank you. So you've been at it for almost a year now, building and growing this coalition, supporting the change in national discourse on this issue. What are some of the wins so far, Ben? And how is the future looking on the campaign?
Well, before we got into it, Colorado overturned qualified immunity on a state level. And then New Mexico has overturned it. The city of New York has overturned qualified immunity, and qualified immunity has been modified, reformed in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And there's currently efforts to overturn qualified immunity in about 12 different states. In addition to that, qualified immunity is part of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, and it's actually the sticking point in terms of getting it through the Senate. Essentially, and our major opposition is the Fraternal Order of Police and the other police unions. And, essentially, if you're a person who currently is immune from prosecution, you don't want to change a law that makes it so that you can be prosecuted. If you're currently not accountable, if someone suggests, well, now we're going to hold you accountable, you don't like that idea. And that's what's going on. So we focused on qualified immunity because we knew that it was the key really to police reform, because you can say whatever you want. You can do trainings, you can do body cameras, whatever. But until you start holding people accountable for breaking the law, you're not going to get people's behaviors to change. Essentially, qualified immunity says that in most situations, cops are immune from prosecution when they break the law, and clearly, that's not a way that we can continue to go forward unless we want to have a police state.
Well, so this is an opportunity to turn protest into policy. And, one of the things Ben and I understand as business people is that the voice of business is so powerful. And as Ben has taught me, as crazy as it may be, when businesses speak, people listen. Politicians listen, the public listens. And for those of us wondering, what can we actually do? This is a constructive thing that we can actually do.
Thank you, Jerry. That leads me to the next question for you. How did you get businesses and business leaders to join the campaign? And is the approach a little bit different for each?
No, we essentially try to explain the facts, and not only the facts, but the opportunity. As has been said, we are in a unique time, and we have an opportunity to make changes, particularly joining together. And businesses don't always join together. And one of the things we also learned is that sometimes people are fearful of raising their voices. And this is a chance when people can get together. And people want to see change. People understand the status quo is not acceptable. We can't keep going the way we've been going. Particularly right after the murder of George Floyd, we had so many business people speak out as we've never heard before. And a lot of the question is, what can we do? We can work within our own organizations, which we must do. But in addition, we can use our voices, as Ben has also taught me, probably the most powerful tool that business has at its disposal.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you so much to both of you for your tremendous work and leadership, leading the way for the private sector on this. This is the leading edge, as Michael was saying, of what we mean by equitable business leadership, using your voice and influence to bring people together to fight one of our most pressing issues. I'd like to transition us now to Q&A because I'm seeing the feeds just blown up a little bit here. So I want to invite all of our listeners to, before we transition to Q&A, learn more about the campaign to end qualified immunity. Get involved. You'll see the link in the chat where you can learn more and also sign on to this movement. And now as we transition to Q&A, I'd like to invite all of our speakers, Rose, Michael, Shaibia, Paul, come on camera. I'll try to pin you up here and we'll get started with some Q&A. Now, I see a lot of questions in here and I have 3 already in mind. Rose, I'm going to start with you. You've closed down Patagonia on election day to spur customers and employees to vote. You've self-imposed an earth tax when you're at Patagonia. You've offered childcare distribution centers to support women, as you mentioned, and much, much more. What do you say to business leaders who struggle with making such bold investments, and after hearing the takeaways, so where many business leaders are now?
Well, I would say that very similar to what Jerry and Ben said. Whenever we make these decisions, there's two outcomes. We do better business, we make more money, and And the other part of it is we attract people to the company who want to work for a company that has a greater purpose than just selling stuff or making stuff. And I think that's probably one of the most compelling parts of, just doing the right thing. And, we're kind of at a critical juncture right now. If we don't take real action right now, I don't think that we're going to want to live in the world that will be left to us. And it's our responsibility as business people to use our voice. And I agree with Ben and Jerry, that business has a really powerful voice, and your employees and your customers expect you to use it.
Thank you, Rose. That's right. Related to that, we hear so often from business leaders, and I see a question from the audience about what to do with pushback that comes in from customers and other stakeholders on a stance of anti-racism. Jerry, I'd love to hear from you on this one. How did you even approach backlash from customers, which was inevitable, right?
It is inevitable. I guess the first thing I'd like to say is, and I don't know if this has been Rose's experience, but for Ben and Jerry's having taken some of these stands, it's not always easy. And it's not always agreed by everybody within the company. And it can be messy work. And having said that, it's the right thing to do. And Ben and Jerry's goes into these activities knowing there's going to be pushback. The people who really take the brunt of it are the people who work with our consumers, people who are getting phone calls, who are getting emails, who are getting texts. And not only that, but there are Ben and Jerry's franchise scoop shops, and you have people working the front lines, 18-year-old kids scooping who are getting abused by people who come in. It's really not that pretty. But at the same time, what came up for me during all these takeaways, during the whole thing, is that from the start, a business needs to be clear about what its values are and what its mission is. And if you have clarity around those things, a lot of what you do flows from that. And if you don't have clarity, it brings up all sorts of questions about what are we supposed to be doing? What's the right thing to do?
Thank you, Jerry. Michael, related to that, we hear questions around ROI and advancing racial equity together in the same sentence. What do you think business leaders are missing there when they're thinking about racial equity strategies from this perspective of it still needs to kind of fit within our bottom line and serve our bottom line?
First thing I would say is, have you actually earned the right to expect a return on investment? Business is very deliberate about strategy setting and making when it thinks about return on investment. But so often we're expecting a return on investment when we haven't put the work in. The strategies aren't right. They're not bold enough. They're not big enough to expect a return on investment. And that's why I centered that 100 million. Because if you want a return on investment, you've got to do something bigger. I'll give you a real practical example. It's been years since the Flint water crisis. And we've learned so much about the epigenetics of stress on children, what happens with toxic stress on brain development, what happens with lead in brain development. And so if you're not going to craft strategy to fix the pipes, it's no need of asking a question about the return on investment in terms of how these children are doing, because we're still poisoning them. And this is a real world practical example of how racism plays out every day. The charity is us high-fiving because we're passing out the water bottles. The structural racism is we're choosing not to fix the infrastructure and to stop poisoning the kids. So it's quite folly to ask for a return on investment when you actually haven't done the work to earn that expectation.
Thank you, Michael. Now, another question from a panelist, and I'm going to open this up to whoever wants to answer. I'm curious to hear thoughts from the panelists and host regarding their belief whether capitalism can exist in the absence of racism as a core pillar for the entire system. And if so, what examples can we reference where this is the case? And if the answer is no, how will for-profit companies lead the way in this shift for the future? Do we have any takers on that one? Can capitalism exist in the absence of racism as a core pillar? For example, does racism drive capitalism? Is it an essential component? Paul, I see you up. Oh,
absolutely
Ben,
not.
please. Good.
No, I don't see racism as a component of capitalism at all. I mean, you could, I suppose, run a business in a way that exploits people racially and make some short-term profits doing it, but I don't really see how racism is an integral part of capitalism.
Any other responses on that? I have a few thoughts, but I'm going to go last. Shabby or Paul, any thoughts?
I would just
yeah,
say
please, Rose.
I would just say one thing about that, which is that, like any system, capitalism needs to evolve. And there's no question that racism has played a huge role in capitalism and the building of the economy as it is right now. But that doesn't mean that it can't evolve and that we can't have hope for a future that has a more just form of capitalism.
Thank you, Rose. Yeah, and that was along the lines of what I wanted to share as well. You know, our nation's founding was based on racism. And so it's hard to have that aspirational future of a world without racism within our capitalist system, but we must have that hope and we must work towards that. So great question, and thank you all for your responses on that. Paul, a question for you. What's the most important thing that you think business leaders can do next? Knowing these takeaways, what's your guidance?
So what comes to mind for me immediate, Mahalet, is to wherever you're at on the fear spectrum, whatever you're afraid of as a corporate leader, try like hell to get past it. And I'll tell you 3 really quick, tangible ways to do that. Number 1 are your peers. You are not alone. Your peers are real human beings. They're all living this, they're all feeling this, they're all living this in their families as well as their professional lives. So get past the fear by finding your peers. Secondly, do not underestimate the power if you find alignment. We've talked about this a few times. It starts with the C-suite and the board, but it's your supply chain, it's with your customers. There is a tipping point that I don't know if everybody understands that's out there. If you reach enough actors in your system that want to tip and change how business is done, it will happen. The last thing I would say is we have talked a long time about how profit and purpose need to align. And it's sort of been this forced mechanism, and it takes an aspirational quality on behalf of the CEO. Here's what's going to happen. The world is starting to force it. And in 20 years, it's going to be like a relic. Like, why did we ask that question? Just like we do with old production methods and old supply chain methods. This is changing right now. And the number one driver that's changing is the talent coming into retaining and staying in companies. They're going to force the change. So if you don't want to be on the bleeding edge on the back end of this, you should be on the leading edge on the front end of this. Try to get past your fear because you can.
Thank you, Paul. Such great points. The next generation workforce is going to drive a lot. Shaibi, I have a question for you. One of our attendees has asked about the third takeaway, uncertainty about the power of equity. Does it mean that business leaders don't believe that focusing on racial equity will drive the various outcomes? Or is it that there's a disbelief that racial equity practices are the best path to driving equitable outcomes?
I would say it's a mix of both of those things, along with the fact that business leaders have just not fully embraced everything that racial equity has to offer. It's very well accepted that, it is a moral imperative, and equity is always going to be the good and responsible thing to do. But there's still a shift in mindset that is needed to help people understand that targeting one group is not going to take something away from other groups. When we're actually, as I mentioned with the curb cut effect, when we're actually developing programs or policies that support those who have been left behind, we see those benefits really spreading out to all of society. And I think it's just something that is going to take a while to sort of shift in our mentality. Part of it is, having business leaders who have embraced that really speak openly about it and share that narrative to demonstrate that this is working in practice. It's not just research that we're seeing, but businesses are doing this, they're embracing it, and be able to share it openly. As you talked, Mahalet, that mentality of, doing what your peers are doing and wanting to be close to them and sort of catching up to them is pervasive. And to the extent that business leaders will be able to talk more about it, I think that mentality will soon start to change. I don't think it's just a matter of, disbelief, but it's not something that is widely accepted. Racial equity is not the driving force in the way that businesses work. And that mentality, the mindsets that have been ingrained in our society for so long, need to shift before we can fully take advantage of the immense opportunities that racial equity has to offer.
Awesome.
Mahalet, it's too bad. I have a question for everybody who's joining us. Obviously, the people who are joining us have a real interest and concern. And I'm wondering if people on this call are finding a way to engage and make change in their own organization or their own lives or their own communities. And how can we help? How can we provide opportunities for people who want to make change?
Jerry, that is a question we can still ask everyone. We'll have a post-event survey and we'll put that in there. That's a fantastic question. Thank you. Before we start to transition towards our closing, I want to ask you, Jerry, anything specific that you have as a call to action to business leaders and businesses to support the campaign to end qualified immunity? Where do you need their support?
We need business leaders to come to our website, holdcopsaccountable.org, to give us your email. We have a whole bunch of actions you can take. We will tell you when we need your help and how we can use your help. We will make it so easy, you're going to wish you had called us earlier.
Well, and the other thing is that I believe, Mahala, you're sending out a letter that business leaders can sign on to join the existing 700 that we have, and that would be tremendously helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you. This has been awesome. Thank you all for your participation, from our attendees and to all of our speakers and special guests. Thank you so much for supporting us. I'm going to turn it over to you, Michael, to close us out.
Thank you. This is a heavy time in our nation, but it's a hopeful time. There are moments in our careers where you live to do great work and the season just isn't right. This is a season for great work. And it's a season for all of us to awaken, to think about using ourselves as an instrument of change. No matter what the step you need to take it. No one needs to judge it. Take that first step. And then think about the first sentence in our equity manifesto where it says, it begins by joining. That's probably one of the most important lines in the equity movement. Because the reality is, you don't have to have the answers right now. But if you join, you will find them. There are folks in community on the leading edge of the equity movement who are paving a way every single day, fighting with limited resources, fighting not known, probably 5 or 10 years ahead of where the issue is. And we can help you find those people. You've heard Ben and Jerry describe an opportunity for you to join, an effort that is already underway and taking root. There are so many of those opportunities. The PolicyLink family, the FSG family, the Just Capital family, we can help you into getting into relationship with movement actors all around the country. So think about taking that first step of joining with others, not having to go it alone. And then the last thing I'll say is this. You know, if you're going to be successful in this work, you will have to listen to voices that you have not usually listened to or had to listen to. That is the power of the equity movement. When I talk about that voice, wisdom, and experience of folks in community, that's where I learn from. That's where I learn how to do the next generation of the work. That's where I get the ideas. That's where I get the brilliance. That proximity to folks who are struggling every day. So if you can join with others and you can begin to attune your ear to voices that you have not often listened to, you will find a way forward. And that's how we're going to make progress here. So I want to thank you for joining us. Especially want to thank Virgin Unite for your generous support. And I want to thank my colleagues who are here today, who's going to be on this journey for many more years to come as we work to usher in a just and fair society. So all the best.